Hi guys, we're on to the fifth or sixth lesson of the resource management topic. Today we're going to be carrying on by looking at water, only this time we're going to be looking at global water demand. Now for the past couple of lessons we've been looking at the three different types of resources: food, water and energy. From this moment onwards we're going to focus specifically on water. So today we're going to look at global water demand, and in the next sort of 4 or 5 lessons, we're going to really go into depth of looking at certain countries and other issues relating to this resource. On the exam, normally you would get the choice to do water, food, or energy. We've chosen to do water because I think, firstly, it's a very interesting topic, and secondly, it should be quite good to get your head around, and it links in really well with other topics as well. So this lesson is going to focus on demand on a global level. Now, as I've already mentioned, we've looked at water in the UK. And if you remember, in the UK, we were talking about how, essentially, some areas of the UK are in water deficit and some areas of the UK are in water surplus. So, for example, the southeast of England, which is where London is in a water deficit, whereas us, being close to North Wales and Scotland, we're in a bit more of a better position. So, a reminder of those two key words: a surplus is too much or more than enough of, and a deficit is not enough. Now, water is an essential resource for human survival, but only about 2.5% of the water on Earth is actually fresh water. The rest is found in oceans, and it's locked up in ice caps and glaciers, so it's actually unavailable for human use. So even though we live on this ridiculously wet planet, a lot of our water isn't actually accessible. So of all the world's water, only 2.5% of it is fresh water. Of that 2.5%, 79% is locked up in ice caps, which only leaves 1% which is easily accessible. And of that 1%, it's broken down into lakes mainly, rivers, soil moisture, and accessible water in plants as well. So even though we live on this ridiculously wet planet, lots of water, a very, very, very small amount of it is actually available for us to use. Now we're going to look at how we're going to try and get around that in the future, but for now we've got to try and remember that figure. So firstly, it's all about access, but also water is in continuous movement around the world. It's called a hydrological cycle. So it relates to things like geology, so where the water is stored, the climate, which influences how much rainfall there is, and the rivers, which move or transport the water. So, for example, if we've got an aquifer underwater, they are only possible with certain types of rock type. If the climate changes, we will have wetter and drier periods that will affect water availability. And finally, with rivers, obviously, a lot of our water flows to rivers. If we have access to rivers, we are okay. If we do not, we might be struggling in the future in terms of what we can and cannot access. So, we're going to look at really two main factors that can cause water surplus or deficit. And they are as follows. There can be two things. It's physical water scarcity, which is things to do with physical geography, or it can be economic water scarcity. And if you remember from everything we've done over the last 2 years, when we see that word economic, it's to do with money, it's to do with finance. So one factor is very much to do with the physicality, the physical geography of that area, whereas the economic side is all to do with money. So for example, for the physical side of things, some countries do not have enough access to water due to climatic reasons. So for example, northern Mali, the country, is in the Sahara Desert. And this is very, very arid, rainfall is low, and the river flow fluctuates. So for example, in those types of areas, because of the varying climate, the river might only flow at its normal capacity of 3 or 4 months a year. There might be months where the amount of water in that river is down by 80-90%. And obviously, that might lead to a water deficit, because in that period, you physically do not have enough water. Okay, so there's not enough water whatsoever for you to have enough to enable normal survival, etc. Economic water scarcity is something a little bit different. Now, economic water scarcity, that country probably does have water, but they do not have the economic means to access it or make it safe to drink. And that's the case in huge parts of Afghanistan. So, for example, when you drink water, when you turn on a tap in this country and the water comes out, that water has been treated in a water treatment site. They put in lots of chemicals like fluoride to make sure that the water is sterile. So that when we drink that water, it is safe, there is no bacteria in it, we do not get ill from drinking that water. It does cost a lot of money to do that, however. The huge amount of infrastructure required to clean and treat water and then transport it around a country is massive. And for some less developed nations like Afghanistan, they simply can't do that. So even though they have water, they don't have the economic means to actually make it safe to drink. They don't have the money to pay for the advanced systems that are needed to make that water usable. So there are two very distinct problems, and they tend to act differently in different places. You don't tend to get both, but obviously, if there was a country that did have both physical and economic scarcity, they really would be in quite a fair bit of trouble. So this is a map here, and this map shows global physical and economic water scarcity. We've done this a few times with maps. There's always seems to be this north-south divide in terms of the global rich, the north up here, and the south at the bottom, obviously towards the south down here. In this sense, I think there's a bit more variation within the continents. So if we look at Western Europe, huge parts of Western Europe and North America have little or no water scarcity. Overall, we're pretty much okay. But let's take the USA. Some parts of Western USA, so eastern Western USA, are experiencing physical water scarcity, or they're approaching physical water scarcity over here. Now, you'll notice that they are not in economic water scarcity because those areas of America are, on the whole, very, very wealthy. The same thing appeals down here in Australia, and it's no coincidence that these areas in red correspond directly with the biome of a desert in those areas. So there are areas of those countries that have a very arid climate. On the flip side to that, you'll notice that large parts of Africa, in particular Central Africa, and also parts of Asia as well, are in economic water scarcity. Now, this is another misconception I think about Africa, is that this whole idea that Africa has no water, inverted commas. That's not true. This part of Africa here is directly along the equator, which means it has a rainforest biome and also has a huge amount of rainfall, which would suggest that these areas here, especially in the middle, like the Republic of the Congo, they should not be having a water scarcity. But the issue is economic. They have all that water, but they do not have the financial means to make it usable, to make it viable. Okay? So that's why when we see these adverts for Africa, they are the problems associated with that. Now, from a kind of philosophical standpoint, it's interesting the difference between physical and economic scarcity. Physical scarcity, I would argue, is more dangerous because in those areas they literally do not have the water. Whereas if we provided the funding, the areas in economic scarcity might be able to actually have safe access to water. But obviously, looking at the map already, we know that is not currently the case. So a second map here, this is a little bit less advanced, and this just shows areas of water surplus in blue and water deficit in red. I want to pause the video, and can you identify 3 areas that have a water surplus and 3 that have a water deficit? Are there any patterns on there? And in which part of the world do you think there is most likely to be a conflict over water in the future? So pause the video, have a look at those 3 questions. Okay, so Hopefully you've realised then, three areas we're in: Africa, Australia, Middle East as a region with water deficit. Surplus is mainly in South America, parts of like Greenland, parts of sort of Northern Europe as well, and Scandinavia, etc. The patterns, like we said, are mainly about north-south divide. And the question at the end was about conflict. And basically, we're in a situation where there are going to be some issues with this in the future. In the past, conflict has always happened over resources. The entirety of human history, resources have been the source of a number of conflicts. In recent history, it's mainly been over things like oil. In the future, it is very, very likely that the biggest conflicts will happen over water. Because if two regions have got scarce water, or they've got a water deficit or scarcity, they might start to fight or argue over the water they have access to. One of the most famous ones is Lake Chad in Africa, which is surrounded by 4 countries. All 4 countries have issues with water supply, so all 4 claim that the water in that lake should be used for their countries. And you can start to see how this is going to lead to problems arising in the future. So there are disputes over water use. And in Africa in particular, we are already starting to see some potential conflicts. So the ones in red are potential conflict spots, and the ones in orange are the areas that are already conflict areas. So, for example, if we look at the River Nile in Ethiopia and Egypt, rivers are a weird concept because who owns a river? If a river runs through 3 or 4 countries, who decides what water they get? Now, the end of the River Nile is in Egypt, but the River Nile runs to Ethiopia. So countries like Ethiopia and Sudan want to use the water at the start of the river, which means there is less water at the end of the river for Egypt. And that has started to cause conflict, and it started to cause military conflict as well. We're now having small armies of countries, small military groups protecting water resources, and also there to act on the interests of those countries. Water conflict events have increased dramatically over the past sort of 100 years, not even that, 80, 90 years. Like I said, in the past, conflict would be over territory, it'd be over things like oil. Nowadays, it's things like water. So in 2017, there were 70 water conflict events. If we flip back to the 1940s or even later 1950s, we'd maybe be getting around 5 a year. In the last 20 years, up to 20, 40, 50, 70 water conflict events. I'll be honest with you, if you've got your geography hat switched on here, you would think that this graph would continue to increase. So as climate change gets worse, as our climate makes water less available, you would imagine that water conflict events would continue to increase. There are some people who believe strongly that any future world war would likely start because of water. So if you've got a country that is very, very wealthy and they've run out of water, they might end up starting a war to gain advantage of a water resource, to gain advantage of a river, to gain advantage of a lake. And I think personally that is quite likely as well. As our world reduces the number of resources and we still have that desire to consume and increase our consumption for them, we could be seeing more conflict events in the future. I think that's why this is a really important topic to study. We're going to look in the next lesson about what impacts that will have on people, and we're also going to look at sort of what the solutions maybe are to this as well. But for now, let's kind of focus in on the fact that these water conflict events are increasing dramatically, which is obviously a big problem. So, 3 review questions as always. The first one, I'd like to explain the 2 factors which can cause water scarcity and deficit. The second one, name 2 areas which have a physical scarcity. Name 2 which have an economic scarcity. To answer that question, you need to flick back in the video to find this map here. You can obviously rewind to do that. And then finally, explain how water conflicts are likely to change in the future. So it's talking about this graph here and this little map here, and give me an answer of how it will change in the future, what happens with a number of conflicts, what might it lead to as well. Any questions, obviously hit up the Zoom link. Other than that, I look forward to reading your answers.